won't be, but I think I want to move in that direction. But I just find these translations very difficult. Like this one of the syllogism. I don't know how you found it.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to read it in all the few languages that I kind of know. So, which are basically English, Bulgarian, and Russian. And the translations in Bulgarian and Russian are vastly superior in my view. But that's not very helpful at all. So, for us, but I do have an example of sort of how different, or different enough these translations can be. Maybe it's just a limitation of the English language when it comes to philosophy. I'm totally convinced of that. But another reason, but there is another major translation of the prior Analytics. It's by Gisela Streicher, the German philosopher taught at Harvard for many years, Streicher, and you may find her choices of wording more beautiful and more useful. The Robin Smith translation doesn't even use the word syllogism. It uses the word deduction, which, of course, that's what it is, but it chooses to change the word itself, which I don't know what he goes into the reasons.
The structure itself is the syllogism.
Right, so he replaces
the structure is the thing, the deductive argumentation is the general term.
So he uses the word deductive argument, which is not incorrect, but for some reason he deviates from the word syllogism, which is universally known in the English language.
Right.
But, so for next week, I think the ambition is to switch to Hegel, and maybe our friend will show up again because
who's that? Rusty?
Yeah, that's okay.
The trot.
Yes. So for next week,
you know Rusty.
The goal is to,
Phil?
like we indicated in that mass email that Josh sent. Is everybody on the
Alan Schulman was called Stop.
Sorry. I'll give you a piece
You were
of
on the
paper.
email. It probably went to your spam. Check your spam. Because I know specifically you were on there.
What happened?
I had to go through the list. And
is everybody else on the mail?
I'm receiving some. I'm not sure if I received the latest. But
Phil, you're on it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I don't need to circulate this fine Japanese paper. Most extraordinary paper.
No, I think everybody here is on the email.
Okay.
Phil, you're on the email.
Yeah.
So the goal is to focus on Hegel's discussion of the syllogism, his initial major presentation, engagement with logic, which comes from the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. Okay, so there are a few sections, 181 to 193. So that's for next time. We have links to the books on the website. So
I'm going to change the first one to the encyclopedia because it's like cut off specifically where you wanted to.
Okay. And then in the Hegel, you'll see.
But it is on the Marxist, Marxism.org or something, I think. But I'll change it on the website.
But that might be from a different translation.
It's the same one.
Oh, it is. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So that's Hegel's reworking of Aristotle's logic, dialectical presentation.
By the way, I'm going to have to double check about this room for next week if
Okay.
you want a whole class on the 18th.
Okay.
Obviously, Christmas Day and New Year's Day, you're not going to have the access to this room, but I'll check and I'll send you a message. I'll maybe even check it out downstairs today. I think we're okay through Wednesday.
Right.
I think Thursday's the day when they dissipate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think it's good. Yeah.
So you'll see that Hegel takes what Aristotle presented, that survived to our times through these notes, lecture notes by students, and, But in Hegel, you're going to see an intensity that's even more intense than with Aristotle. Because with Aristotle, we have these fragments that are very intense, but with Hegel, it's even more intense to sort of attempt to create some kind of a structure, a formation of thinking in a formed way. And then the other major article would be the Ilenkov article called Our Schools Must Teach How to Think, which was recently translated, fairly recently, 10 years ago. But it was an article from the 70s. It's a big article, 40 pages, but it covers a wide ground. It engages with Hegel and Kant, not so much with Marx. And it's a great article because it talks about all these fundamental concepts like negation, the concept itself, abstraction. And it's written for a popular audience. It's written like for a Soviet journal with circulation of like 45 million people or something. 45 million copies. So it's not like a philosophy text, strictly speaking, but of course it is a philosophical text. So we'll probably start with the Alenkov, just to shift gears, and then we'll arrive at the Hegel. As background, though, if you have time and want to suffer more in this pleasure of sort of getting deeper into Hegel, Hegel's introduction in the Phenomenology of Spirit has interesting sections connected to the syllogism. And then Ilenkov's essay, Hegel's Science of Logic, which has recently been translated actually a year ago in English, is another huge article that focuses only on Hegel's logic and tries to sort of make it, grapple with it from the point of view of a mid-20th century thinker.
The syllogism in the phenomenology is at 145 too.
Yeah,
145, okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's in the introduction as well, but
yeah.
the section where he
engages
brings
with
it up
more,
is 145.
Yeah, more profound way than 145, yeah.
Recently, a book's been published of all of Hegel's, most of Hegel's introductions to his major texts, and that itself functions as a book. If you just read the introductions. Okay, so also lastly, if you visit our site, there's a link to a new movie by a young Russian cinematographer about Ilenkov that was published on, that was released on YouTube. It was shown at some major film festival, I think last year.
It's great. I watched it.
It's great. It has great quotes. It has great sort of audio clips of Ilenkov lecturing, where he actually translates a poem of Hegel's in English, but I will reserve the poem for next time. It's incredible.
No.
It's brutal. Maybe I'll say it now, because it's so interesting. This is Ilenkov's translation from the German and Russian, and then from somebody from Russian to English. So I'm sure these have been published. So I don't know if the translation will make much sense. I did my best to sort of change it to make it more. But Hegel said, he's sort of addressing his students or something, I don't know. Hegel said, place your confidence in the outcome of the struggle, son of God. Break away from the calm peace, from yourself, from your present universe. Move forward and seek to be more than what you were yesterday and today. You won't become better than your epoch, age, but your age will eventually become better. Like, it's one of the most beautiful kind of, the futility of like trying to be godlike, but then when failing, you kind of improve. You kind of leave a signpost in the time in which you were alive. And that's exactly what he did, right? And that we can all do this in our own way.
Did he, when he went to that deaf and blind school, was he sent out there, or he chose to go there?
So Ilenkov's one of his major contributions, I think, to world history is there was a school in the Soviet Union created by a psychologist, experimental school for totally disabled kids, who were deaf, blind, and mute. And these kids would be usually consigned to Helen Keller was the American counterpart, but she wasn't deaf, blind, and mute. I think she had one of those senses intact. So the idea was these kids were consigned to like marginal lives, like they would live in a special home, totally deaf and blind, mostly deaf and blind to the world that surrounded. They wouldn't develop speech, and they would just die very young or shortly. So this well-known Russian Soviet psychologist said, well, this can't be true if Marx's entire, or if the entire philosophy of the Western Enlightenment was correct, especially Marx's thinking that social relations form who we are more so than any other thing. These kids should be socialized. It should be possible to socialize these kids from birth to the point where they should develop no less than any other kid who is not physically disabled in some extreme way. So him and his friend Ilenkov basically set up the curriculum for the school. So they invented a new system of communication for these kids through tapping, because they could only feel sensations through their fingertips and through their toes, basically, because they couldn't hear, see, or speak. So they develop a curriculum, and almost everybody graduated from high school. I think there were like 18 of them or 17 of them. 4 of them went to college, like 7 of them went to college, and 4 of them got PhDs, and like 1 of them became a famous sculptor, just purely by touching, without ever seeing their creations, right? And the other one, who was interviewed in the movie, became a noted psychologist. He's still alive. He's on Facebook. Like, I belong to the Selekov Facebook group, and he's there, and he like sends these poems like regularly, like these incredibly intense poems.
Oh my god,
that's cool.
And he speaks in the video, and so Selekov, this is proof that the entire racist argument is completely mute. Like, if you still were in doubt that racism is a sort of a social construction that has these real effects, but it's totally based on, he said, you basically have proof that human development is purely a social condition. I mean, of course, plus the basic apparatus that you're born with, the brain matter or whatever that allows you to think in this particularly human way. It was very expensive to do this.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing too is about this entire Soviet, educational system, that Roman Jakobson had a fascination with aphasia, and many of the work that he did was on aphasia, especially in the lectures on sound and meaning, put out stuff of which Lacan was very interested in too. Later on. Yeah. So this opens up a lot about the educational system in Russia. Jakobson is a Russian immigrant to Paris, right? Obviously, and then Gulf State. But just to show you the level of the education and the ability to transcend these kind of limits of Western culture. We can't do that, that's disabled, that's special needs, all these kind of stupid categories that we end up with here in the United States, with people, of this kind of ilk. Yeah, so, yeah.
No, it was a major achievement.
Major shift, yeah.
Sorry. Did you have a question?
Yeah. No, it's okay.
Okay. So I think Ilenkov is kind of being rediscovered as a sort of a major 20th century philosopher, but he was, active in these other fields of like education or schooling or learning. And then there was a beautiful quote by Mayakovsky, of course, in the film that I want to share with you. I don't know why I'm bringing these things, but I think they're related to the dialectical movement. And we're building up to Hegel, who basically said that the purpose of a well-developed or fully developed human being, who's basically deploying their ability to think, is to struggle and persist through the tensions of the contradiction. This is like one of the great Hegelian quotes. To persist through the tension of the contradictory moment, in which or through which the process of discovery, you can extend it towards Heidegger to the uncovering. Mm-hmm. You can extend it towards Marx, Lenin's politics, the persisting through the tension of the revolutionary moment. I mean, these were things that all of these people understood. Or in music, like you can listen to, I always listen to 70s Miles Davis, but,
that may be hard on you.
No, the free period, I think, is underappreciated by jazz kind of fans. But I was listening to the Sun Ra Orchestra and some of those great saxophone solos by the tenor saxophone player Gilmore, and it's incredibly difficult music to listen to, almost impossible if you just listen to it with our filters, because it's basically shrieking for 28 minutes, what sounds like shrieking, but it is persisting through the tension of the demand that the music makes for somebody like that who's already played through the entire corpus of jazz and finds it extremely boring and trivial. Those same old bebop chords that he played already and mastered. So what is next to do? Well, next is you stop playing music, which you can't do, or you invent this kind of, you negate bebop essentially. You throw out everything that you did before, except maybe some contours or the instrument that you play or the configuration, which is still a jazz combo. But you do it through a completely different musical language. So I think this metaphor of Hegel's applies in general to human creativity in general.
I was reading Adorno's lectures on the dialectic again today, And one of the things he says, at times he uses the word refutation for negation.
Refutation.
Which is actually a really interesting. It was really interesting because that's the, you know, when you challenge that object position, that refutation of that position is when you overcome it, when you get to the next level. I thought that was actually an interesting shift in some sense, and it sort of made that relationship very clear to me.
Clear, yeah.
As
It's
a
interesting.
refutation.
That Adorno was probably struggling to how to present this material to the
Right.
students in a way that would be most vivid, and of course he was a great writer.
Yeah.
I mean, those lectures are amazing. If you haven't read the Adorno lectures, they've been publishing volumes now of the late lectures, like in the 60s and 50s. And I only read the one we read in the class in your seminar. Stanley's seminar.
Yeah.
There were
Sort of
amazing
mine, but-
lectures.
It's just Adorno's lecture.
Adorno's lectures, like if you go to Amazon and you just sort of enter lectures Adorno, there's all kinds of themes.
It's called Introduction to Dialectics.
That's the
Lectures
one
he gave in
particular
a summer of, I think, 1957, 58, something like
Yeah.
that. And then there's lectures on the negative dialectics, on his work on dialectics that he, you know, which is really his response to Heidegger and Husserl. Yeah.
I mean, I just want to propose this here because we're a group of very different and interesting backgrounds. I mean, we have, you know, philosophers and political activists, and everyone is a thinker, of course, and artists, visual art, film, visual art,
Performance art.
performance art,
Yeah.
music,
Yeah.
and kind of philosophy getting into. So I think we can apply, I think it's really a good question to look at structure formation in thinking, which would be philosophy. I mean, said in a vulgar way, structure formation, you know, how do you establish formations of thought? Well, you need this kind of fundamental philosophy, some kind of a method, which in this case is a type of logic. In Heidegger, it's a different kind of a method. In Marx is dialectical logic. In Anankês and Hegel's dialectical logic, but there are other. In Deleuze is something else, and Lacan is something else, and Freud is something else. But of course, these are applicable and exist in the visual arts. In music, there are structure formations in music as well. In visual arts, in film. So in politics, in doing politics, as we know, there's structures without which you can't. So this is sort of a fundamental question. What is the structure forming thing that is active in your field of life, you know? And it just can't be, you know, eclecticism or pure improvisation, because improvisation itself is a structure formation, or it requires or presupposes a structure formation.
Mm-hmm.
You know? I had an argument once with a friend of mine who's a punk musician, and she said, well, in punk, like she was being like provocative. She said, in punk, we don't care about structure the way you care about it, let's say, in free jazz or experimental rock or whatever. You don't even need to play your instrument well, which is true for a lot of punk bands, for a lot of bands in general. But my answer was, but not for the best punk bands. Which of course was a bad answer, because what is the best punk band? But that's not true for punk either.
Well, it's not even true. It's like rock and roll structure, 2 chords,
Exactly.
3 chords.
Exactly. So there is a structure in punk music as well.
Yeah.
But if you listen to like Black Flag or something, I don't know, there are virtuosos.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, you could also think of structure or formal structure as the kind of concretization of the historical form also, you know. So it's not, there's implicitly a form
Right.
to punk music. It's historic. It's this historical moment. You know, it's many more historical.
Which it
moments
inherited all of that, or
Exactly.
some of that, but
Exactly.
it did inherit.
to get to that place.
Yeah, the instrument, the visual, you know, the harmonic language of rock.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, just one more word about the categories, which of course we could have gone if we had like 3 years through, for example, the other chapters. But just to show you how good Aristotle was, assuming this is sort of part of a course on logic that his students wrote down that survived to our time. But in the categories, book 3 of the categories, there's a foreshadowing of the syllogism, the structure, where in chapter 3, in our translation of the categories, he says, I'm just going to read it because it's like 2 sentences. He says, this is in 1b10, the chapter 3 at the very beginning. He says, whenever one thing is predicated of another as of a subject, because this becomes important in the syllogism uses predication the way we talked about it in the categories, right? Subject, predicate, and universals, particulars. All things said of what is predicated will be said of the subject as well. For example, and here is the syllogism, the first, second premise, and the conclusion in prototypical embryonic form. For example, man is predicated of the individual man. Right? So man, which is a universal, is predicated of the individual man, Socrates, which is a particular. An animal of man. So animal will be predicated of the individual man also, for the individual man is both a man and an animal. Here, by the way, is presented the form of the syllogism as sort of like an introduction. And this is just a sort of an illustration of how, when we read the categories, things may appear on one level very straightforward and kind of, there's like a pedantic, careful build-up of concepts from simple to more and more complicated, right? Yeah. In the categories, for example, as you remember, we started with what is how things get named, and sort of differences in naming and how to name things and what they mean. And then we end with something very complicated like contraries or contradictions. But it takes 10 books to get there. The same thing with, however, if we read the categories in a different way, all of a sudden we see snippets of foreshadowing of the logical forms themselves, which is an even more complicated layer, which follows further on in his presentation. So it's just interesting to read these things. Having said that, I think today's presentation of the syllogism will be like scholastic in a way. I'm just going to do my best to present the basic arguments, and then I'll leave it maybe from the very beginning of next class for a more interesting reading of the first and second and third figures that Aristotle is making, that perhaps got lost in the scholastic interpretation later in the centuries. So, okay. Oh, and the Mayakovsky quote just shadows Hegel in a certain sense. So Mayakovsky was delivering a funeral speech at his friend, the poet Esenin's grave, who killed himself. So Mayakovsky said, our planet is poorly equipped. This is again a translation from the, so I don't know what the English translation of this is. Our planet is poorly equipped for delight, or I guess one must snatch pleasure, happiness from the days that are. In this life, it is not difficult to die. To make life, however, is more difficult by far. Right? So, of course, and Mayakovsky must kill himself after this as well. But there is something in this, again, this sort of preoccupation or intense preoccupation with this kind of tension of what does it mean to live, to really live.
Where is that from?
This is from Mayakovsky's funeral speech on Esenin's grave.
It's on its grave site.
Grave site. Yeah.
Okay.
Or during Esenin's funeral. Esenin killed himself in the 20s.
He said himself, he foreshadowed his death he enumerated his death by writing a poem on the planet is poorly equipped.
Yes.
Okay. It's more difficult to live by. I got it, I just wanted to make sure.
It's more difficult.
Right about this, yeah.
By far it is more
said
difficult to make a life.
His death warrant, yeah.
Yeah. It is by far more difficult to make life than it is to die. In this life. Right? So, okay, so let's now shift to this.
So that's a letter that reached its destination.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It was a response to an Esenin poem from before, which basically said the same thing.
Right.
In not so many words.
Right.
I just want to announce this because if there are any translators from Russian to English, there's a great book written in Russian on Aristotle's logic that is not translated in any language, but it deserves to be translated. And I became aware of it through my friends and colleagues from Sofia, Bulgaria, in the Institute for Critical Studies of Capitalism, Supermodern Capitalism, who pointed my attention to it. But the book is by a Soviet scholar of Aristotle by the name of Lukanin, who, as far as we know, only wrote this one book and nothing else, and then disappeared from history. But it's like one of those great books that, interpretation, a Hegelian interpretation of Aristotle's logic, which deserves to be translated. It was written in 1984 or something like that. So some of my interpretations are directly following Lukanin's text, although not necessarily in the presentation of the syllabus. So I just want to start by reading a few general comments on the syllogism that I found very helpful, both from Lukanin and both from sort of me thinking about this stuff a little bit, and from other places that I found interesting. And then we can sort of present. So maybe the first thing to say is that it is implicit in Aristotle's thinking the following question. Right? So this is obviously the thing that preoccupies him in this work. How do we think? Right? How do we think? And implicit in Aristotle's thinking about the syllogism and also the categories is that reason has the property to divide the things that are being thought into contradictions. Right? So the human, there's an inherent human ability to be sensitive to contradictions, to almost seek them or to precipitate them or to identify them. To set things in opposition to each other, at times in cause and effect relations, of activity grounded on justifications and consequences. Right? So in Aristotle's logic, this seems to be the implication, among other things. This is a requirement, if you will, for human thought as such. Otherwise, we function only as receivers of other people's reasoning, which we do also. Right? We can function both as receivers and nothing more, or we can function as thinking beings that push through the contradictions in order to gain understanding that wasn't there before. I.e., in that case, when we are receivers, we don't think, but we become automated, to use a contemporary language, machine-like. Many people have commented on this. Kant, when he writes in the letter, what is enlightenment, the essay for that Berlin newspaper, I forget the name of the paper, Kant differentiates between mature and immature human beings, and what makes somebody mature is the fact that they can't really think for themselves fundamentally. They're always on the receiving end. They need that relationship of dependency. He makes this analogy, kind of like domesticated animals, he says, are in a relation to their masters, those who think and can provide for them and think for them and sort of use them as essentially, they can use them as tools, they can use them as slaves, they can use them at their pleasure, or whatever the case might be. But the immature human being is the human being that always is in a relation of dependency on the question of thinking or making sense of the world to some other external source out of them, meaning another human being. And he gives example, the priest will pray for you, or the teacher will think about math for you, or the commander will order for you, or the police person, the cop, will tell you what to do. And at the end, you can live your life that way in that automated fashion, essentially as a tool of others' wishes or wills or power. But that's not really what human beings ultimately have the potential to become. And you can find echoes of many, great thinkers. Marx with Homo faber, faber, the creative being. Heidegger talks about this too. You can find this kind of a sentiment in Heidegger when he talks about das Man, right? In that sense, or when he.
Well, that's the anonymous they.
Right.
That the dictatorship of the they self is out of this whole notion of the culture that needs the guardians to tell them what to do. Which is a very interesting thing, because in some ways the whole postmodern, the real divide was really on that no longer do we have the capacity for emancipation. This was the Leotardian position after writing, 5 years after writing the postmodern condition, and the question that was raised, shall we organize for our pleasure? Which is a Desadian question, which is very interesting, which was the reactionary against, so to speak, the French Revolution and its relationship to the Enlightenment. So you begin to see this, unfolding like it does today, that you have these wings, that are going on in thought, also this, just trying to historicize it. I mean,
because you just reminded me of Deleuze also when he
Yeah.
writes, Deleuze has a great video lecture on YouTube has subtitles in English for people like me who can't read French, unfortunately. But it's an excerpt of a Deleuze lecture from 1984, 87. But you can, if you search Deleuze Societies of Control, where he talks about societies of control before the publication of his essay, Societies of Control. And he has a very interesting description of postmodern or supermodern, you could say also. What is control? The function of political power in our time. And he says, control, societies of control, which is sort of the world after Foucault's biopower, is a society that depends on or is activated and organized through words dash passwords. Parole, in the French word. So everything is functioning through word. Somebody is translated in English as word orders. There's this kind of a external thing that directs and shapes our action, which could be represented by the password, which functions as checkpoints. We live life through a series of checkpoints, Deleuze said. Whether it's the checkpoint that you want to pay your electrical bill, electricity bill, well, you need to know your password. You want to check your email, you need to know your password. Or you have to surrender your fingerprint to the device, which is even worse. You want to do something else, you want to do whatever, there's always going to be some kind of a command-like structure that takes the form of a password. Or in this today, like biometric, equivalence or whatever. So there's no reason there. There's no engagement, bilateral, if you will, engagement necessary. It's purely a one-directional, unidirectional relationship. Now I'm really I'm getting excited, but Dadu has this also in his discussion of, because I know you inspired me to look at Dadu a little bit.
No, I'm not a big Dadu either. Anyway,
I only read this little bit, so when Dadu's writing the third volume of Being in Time, Being an Event, the third volume, but in the second and third volume, the mathematical thinking behind it has to do with this theory of foundational mathematical theory that's not set theory, but it's, of course I'm forgetting the name now, but it has to do with the study of describing mathematical structures through vectors, through one directional, the arrow goes sort of this way, let's say, and then diagonals can be formed. In other words, there's this kind of a directionality. I used to know this stuff like 15 years ago, a little bit more when I was doing this, but the idea is, again, this sort of what Kant was talking about, what Heidegger were talking about, and I think what Aristotle is basically implying here is that in the absence of this kind of activation of thinking and struggling through justifications and consequences of thought, the alternative is simple mechanistic functioning as the receiver of thought, because you don't have the capacity to negotiate either contradictions, or you have no capacity to arrive at answers that are justifiable, or through some kind of reason. Anyways, but I think there's a huge implication, not only in thinking in general, or in politics, or in the arts, or there's got to be some kind of a what am I trying to say? There's got to be some kind of a way of being that's not just automated existence based on receiving or receivership of somebody else's or of some other structure's ideas. Okay.
I mean, I think what you're really hinting at here is that the technological era, if you will, or whatever we really want to call this, technocratic, capitalism at this stage, has really created a kind of anti-dialectical thinking. And based on this whole moment of the Kantian enlightenment that does not happen, that most people lack both the courage, and are lazy enough to be able to become
Because laziness is
subjected
another
to this
part
mind. It's
that
another
Kant
part
says.
of it,
By
which is
being
very,
lazy,
very,
you become this kind of receiver of already existing wisdom,
Right.
and you do not develop your own innate
Right.
ability.
So
It's
the-
laziness, convenience, and fear.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, this becomes, a moment in which the guardian class, and at this point, it's really the people writing the software. It creates a kind of new nominalism where name and object are in a one-to-one correspondence, and there's no thinking through this, even syllogistically, much rather than more complicated forms of dialectics. So we live in a kind of neo-feudal society under the most advanced capital structures. It's kind of interesting to see this at work in terms of the development of the mind that is so low, right, in most cases, to that of where capital is in terms of derivatives, complicated schemes of new things, the ability to extract resources, the ability to keep some kind of regulation going in terms of the functioning of everyday life in most places, even though it varies, in enormous degrees. So the question really, to me, and you raise, this is a great thing, and I know you've thought about this for a long time, is really that, our era is really the product of a massive anti-dialectical thinking, and especially in the United States, one of the reasons we don't have the political sphere and the political space, because at least in places like Chile, Argentina, even though Brazil's fascist, they did have a very upsurgent, insurgent kind of educational system, that put things into place, as well as we know in Europe. Look at the French, they say the American workers don't have pensions to fight for, right? This is the difference. They're fighting against, pension, a little bit of reform, right? Much less, not to take them away, but just because they dare to touch, then Macron dares to touch. So you have to ask, where does this political power, in a sense, come through in terms of thought and politics? And I know you know Vygotsky very well, thought and action. What is this relationship that's going on?
Vygotsky, the great
yeah,
Soviet psychologist, who was influential for Ilenkov as well, had this beautiful thing about answer to the question, where does thought come from? And he said, thinking, he was paraphrasing, of course, a whole line of post-Enlightenment thinkers. He said, thinking always comes between, emerges in the course of a conversation between two people, right? So in other words, thinking is not something that's just purely innate to our internal ability to make sense of the world through logic or whatever. It's that, but it also actually really emerges in the conversation between two people. In other words, it's a social formation, like Josh said. Ilenkov would add that thinking itself is historical cultural dimension. In other words, it operates through centuries of accumulated human activity. Right? So, and then he has an interesting point about AI, because we'll get to that essay probably next semester, his critique of cybernetics, the way cybernetics has become used at the dawn of the world that we live in. He says, you can create a computer system that has artificial intelligence. But in order to approximate even partially human intelligence, you have to also faithfully recreate, the computer has to faithfully recreate and understand and freely use the entire accumulated body of culture, centuries long, that goes into, for example, a single human being who's born in New York City today on this date in a particular family, particular ethnic or social class background, and inherits all of that cultural baggage, if you will. The computer has to be aware of that in order for it to actually start to replicate, right? What a human being does when a human being acts as a human being. Otherwise, it's just a pure simulation that only humans can understand, because to them it simulates, it mimics actual human intent. So in other words, these idiots who actually think that they can create a sentient being by taking a picture of the human neurons and the biochemical structure of the brain and they can upload databases of accumulated conversations on YouTube,
Right.
they think they're recreating tales.
But I think part of the problem is the behaviorism as a psychology has taken center stage for so long.
Well, that's
that this
true.
becomes almost a normative moment, right? That
Right.
most people are already, indoctrinated under behaviorism, much less,
I would add, in a sort of,
sure.
again, like a vulgar reduction, just to be kind of provocative.
Yeah, sure.
I would say, yes, you can make AI be, maybe overcome the limits of human intelligence, only if you dumb down humans to the level of a computer. Like, that's the prerequisite.
Yeah.
If you can do that, if you can reduce human language, for example, into 140 characters, and that becomes sort of normalized over the next 100 years as literature or as mode of writing and reading. And if you stultify, for example, all the other profound human abilities like reading and, for example, or aesthetic sense or artistic sensibilities or creativity into the creativity of what a computer can basically do, or easily simulate, well, then you can make artificial intelligence appear to overcome or matched sort of the generic functioning of a human being.
Yeah, I think should talk in this light about game theory too, because the game theory is really applied such in things like Big Blue playing Kasparov, who becomes a hedge fund manager after he gets defeated by Big Blue. How is it possible that this artificial intelligence, programmed, in the history of chess, is able to beat the most, creative and world-class chess
Because it
champion?
has no meaning. When when computers play chess, they derive no meaning from it. Because they're not capable of deriving meaning. So this is a great question, because the whole, I think the main point, and I'm getting this from Buchanan also, is that the purpose that Aristotle struggled with the syllogism and why he thought this was an important tool to have as thinking beings, in his response to the Stoics. Later I'll share the Stoics, the Stoic philosophers of his time had a critique, or after his time, during his time, had a critique of the syllogism as unnecessary mental gymnastics. Okay? So, of three-part structure. And Aristotle has a good answer, and Buchanan says, and I agree, that the whole purpose of suffering through the syllogism is that it exposes the beauty of the meaning that you derive from going through the motions. This is about meaning, what's meaningful to people. Rather, whether it's beautiful, whether you experience it as beauty or as some kind of sense of pleasure, or maybe a sense of pain that's pleasure. Whatever the case might be, it has to be meaning. This is the whole point of being human, right? We seek meaning in all the different forms that thing takes shape in our body, in our mind. Computers have no ability to sense meaning. So it doesn't matter if the computer defeated a human chess player. It's completely meaningless. It's the ultimate mechanistic act. So what's the relevance of that for humans? None. There's no need to have a computer program unless you're training to play other humans, and you use the computer to improve your own ability to play chess. Maybe that gives you pleasure as the human. But the computer is simply a sound. It's like a what is that tool that ping pong players use this? They have my dad was a ping pong player, so they would fold the table like this, the ping pong table, so when you would practice the table would return, would simulate another player. But there's no pleasure in that. There's just sort of mechanistic training, and the pleasure is reserved when you play the
Hand-eye coordination.
and hand-eye coordination. Yeah, the basic stuff,
Yeah.
And then the pleasure is when you actually play another human being, This is why massively online video games, people have argued, and I think it's true, are very pleasurable for people who like video games. In that sense, is that you're actually playing with other players. You're actually playing with other humans. I mean, through the medium of the computer, human-created computer simulation or whatever. But the moment players stop playing in that particular, I play this game EVE Online. It's like a side. I don't play it now, but I played it for 8 years. And the moment the real human players leave the solar system where you're playing the game, and only the computer-generated players are there, the game becomes boring and everybody just logs off, usually. Because it's stupid. It's just a machine that. Anyway, so back to the syllogism. So let's just present the syllogism first, and then we can go back. Maybe we can go back to the more more important questions as to why Aristotle thought this would be an important way to think and to use the syllogism and its logical forms as ways of demystifying the world that we create or that we're part of. And maybe somebody 2,000 years later to study capital, the circulation of capital, using a highly modified version of this through another thinker to give us a book that generations of thinkers have used to make sense of the world that they live in. Marxist Capital, for example. So here we have what Aristotle is presenting here is the categorical syllogism. Why the categorical? Because the structure of argumentation here uses and takes advantage of everything that he already presented in the categories that we've discussed already. Right? The relationships between the universal and the particular, the differences, of how predication happens, and all the things that the categories expose about human thinking. For example, contraries, oppositions, and how they're resolved, qualities, quantities, and if you want to sort of have a brief review of this, I can just point your attention just by reading a sentence or two. For example, we talked about substance, but in book 6, book 5 is really long. But in book 6, for example, of the categories where Aristotle introduces quantities, it's very interesting. So he says, of the things that exist, some quantities are discrete, others are continuous. Some are composed of parts, which have position in relation to one another. Others are not composed of parts which have a position. So what are discrete quantities? And all of a sudden he unravels an entire universe, right, of human thought. Discrete quantities are number and language. That's very minor, point. So what are numbers or discrete quantities that have particular features that you should be aware of if you're interested in studying numbers or understanding numbers? What is language? What are continuous quantities? Lines, surfaces, bodies. And by the way, he says, besides these, time and place. So in 2 sentences, we have the entire human apparatus of studying being and the universe. Questions of temporality, questions of place. And then he goes on and on and on in describing what is a line, what is time. What is time? And of course, this is taken up by Newton, among other people. This is taken up by Hegel. This is taken up by Heidegger. So what is time? So in the original canonical Aristotelian presentation, what is time in book 6 of the categories? Time, also, and place are of this kind. Just to read the sentence above that, it says, similarly, in the case of a body, one could find a common boundary, a line or a surface, in which the parts of the body join together. Time, also in place, are of this kind. For present time joins on both ends, past and future. Right? So in the temporality of Aristotle's world, there is the division of time between past, present, and future. Of course, this already is a triad. Right? This already is a triad. Just like the syllogism, it's a 3-part structure. And of course, Hegel's philosophy is based on a triad as well, and so is Marx's. And of course, we have to wait until Heidegger's revision to move away from this kind of presentation. But of course, people are still working on ontologies of time. I already know somebody who's a great thinker, but I'm not going to say anything more about it until the article is translated to English, so you can read it for yourself. But there's a major ontology of time that has been composed by one of my friends who writes in Bulgarian that uses Hegel's syllogism, Hegel's logic, past, present, and future, in a completely new way, to present us a new ontology of time, which would be very interesting to read vis-a-vis Heidegger or others. But more on that later. So the categorical syllogism. A categorical syllogism, then, is a particular kind of argument that contains 3 categorical propositions. 2 of them are premises or justifications, as some people say, and the third one is the conclusion that follows from those 2 premises. So if we map out, we can say this, is a particular, there are other kinds of arguments, of course, but he's interested in this one right now, is a particular kind of argument that contains three categorical propositions. Okay? And if we want to have a diagram of this, so there's the first premise, the second premise, and the conclusion. So of course here we have three propositions. Let's do an example just to be nice and scholastic or diligent in the So the canonical examples that Aristotle of course have to do with Socrates or men, all men, So here is an example that's often given. All men are mortal. By the way, the propositions have to make sense, right? Why are they categorical propositions? Because they leverage, the meaning emerges in the predication process. This is how, what's being predicated allows the reader of the syllogism, of the proposition to determine whether what's being said is true or false. Okay? So that's why they're called categorical, because they leverage everything that Aristotle already went over in the notion of subject-predicate relations and everything that follows thereof. And all those hierarchies of universal to particular, what can be universal, what can be, and the fourfold table of Porphyry that we discussed last time, and so on and so forth. So all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, is mortal. It's just an example. Right? So we have the first premise, the second premise, and then the conclusion. Right off the bat, though, it's important to notice that there's a movement here. There's a movement of the universal to the particular. Right? So there's a movement as you go from here to here, right?
Well, the all gives it away as the universal, right, grammatically, right?
Yeah.
The all, which would be a major premise, the minor premise would be your particular, right? From which the inference
we're going to get to the major premise and then the minor premise. Yeah. So in other words, all men are mortal. That's a statement that involves universal categories. Men, mortal. Right? And then now the focus of the argument becomes more specific and thus more useful. Socrates is a man. And if this is true, is this true that all men are mortal? Is this true in the context of human life? Yeah, there's nobody immortal unless Bezos or I forget who. There's like a bunch of characters in Silicon Valley who believe in the singularity and then immortality through.
Yeah, but you can complicate matters. You could say biological mortality versus that of immortality.
Yes, Aristotle is clearly immortal because he has transcended the death of his own physical body through the ages. Right, that's true. But I had a great teacher once, a music teacher by the name of, who was a philosopher by the name of Herbert Brun at the University of Illinois. And Brun always said, he asked a question. He said, he was a student of Adorno. He said, very intense, very unfriendly kind of polemics. That's how he taught. Like you have to be uncomfortable,
that's what happens,
fearful, and thus persist through the tension of being uncomfortably put on the spot constantly. So he would always ask a question like, like, what's a great book? What makes a book a great book, or a great piece of music a great piece of music? Like the most offensive question to a bunch of graduate students who are like postmodern and, you know, violently react to that horrible mid-20th century modernist dogma. There's no big narratives, you know. What is Brune talking about? What makes a great, you know, a great anything work of art? And he would stare at us and he would be like, you know, say something like, little children don't know anything. And then he would say, a very beautiful sentence, he would say a great book or a great anything manages to successfully retard its decay into nothingness through time. And this was incredible because, and then he would give examples like, take Shakespeare, for example. Shakespeare may perhaps be less relevant at times, let's say 1,000 years from now, or 100 years from now, or even now, but it's still relevant, right? It's still sort of in use, if you will, or it might, or a particular line of thinking, or a particular thinker might disappear, right, through time. But then it might, that thinker, she might be recovered or rediscovered, and again become relevant. So even though the physical person is gone, their ideas or their impact of their work or the force of their work might be present long after their biological temporal decay. So that's true. But Aristotle wasn't implying this here, you know, because he was saying categorical propositions focus on, although he could have been in his own way, but all men are mortal. If we interpret this more narrowly, right, this is certainly true biologically, right? Like we're all going to die.
Well,
now, yeah.
It's a political statement too, because he goes to his death, his mortality becomes famous among the Greek philosophical community.
That's true.
It's a very, you know, he's very conscious of writing such a thing. Right.
In the after.
Yeah.
I mean, being a student of
Yeah,
Plato,
yeah,
of
yeah,
course, was,
sure, of course.
as you know, Plato's life was changed
Yeah.
when he witnessed, you know, the death of Socrates, and that, of course, was transformative for Plato. And thus Aristotle, of course, was part of this conversation, this moment. So all men are mortal. This is true. Socrates is a man. Is this assertion also true? Yes. This Socrates is also mortal. Right? So there's a certain flow that, on the level of human ontology, makes sense. You know, because these are statements that have a truth value, if you will, and if indeed this is true, and then this is true, then this conclusion must necessarily be also true. However, the conclusion is only true to the extent that that the first and the second premise are true. The conclusion cannot be made true from any outside information. This is the requirement of the syllogism. Which sounds like a trivial thing to say, but if you're writing a book, for example, on what is capitalism today, or if you're writing a book on what is politics today, and if you arrive at certain conclusions that you did not, if you arrive at certain conclusions that are based on certain things that were not necessarily part of the book itself or implied in the book in a very direct manner, then Aristotle would probably say, you're being sloppy, and the force of your argument will suffer. So there's all kinds of immediate implications in terms of doing, I mean, arguably we can argue against this, of course. This is only one way of establishing, of structuring things. But is the foundational or fundamental truth, or is the fundamental meaning that you're after, what is it grounded in? What is it based in? How do you get here? How can you assert that Socrates is mortal? Well, because you think so, or because it seems obvious to you? Okay, great, but that doesn't have very great force of persuasiveness for other people other than you, right? So how do you arrive at your meaning, or at your corpus of meanings? Is there a particular line of thinking? Is there a particular journey that your argument, if you will, draws on as it arrives in its final form? So this becomes an important consideration for not only for Kant, but for Descartes, for all the great thinkers in this tradition. You know, the Enlightenment tradition, which of course was a rediscovery of the ancient Greek tradition. I mean, you can apply this to music. You know, it's like, you know, if you're going to improvise a composition, like, why do you play what you play? Well, you arrive at the actual improvised piece of music because there's a certain inherited and presupposed things that you're already going to play, or that allow you to play that. You know, I mean, of course, you can violate this. You can introduce errors that are. You can say, I was inspired to conclude that Socrates is mortal because of another presupposition X that exists outside of these two premises. Okay, but then it won't be a syllogism. It will be something else. That's fine. It's okay. This is not the only way to think. You know, Aristotle never says that. You know, this is just one way to create structure formation. Okay. Again, I should add this. Let's say if we broadly call our initial example A and then B, we should say a little bit more about a premise. So premise, we already said it, but right? So a premise is a sentence which either affirms or denies a predicate of a subject. A premise is a sentence. Why sentence? Well, we already went through this when we discussed the categories for two reasons. That's how humans communicate. And so, i.e., if we communicate using language, spoken or written language or whatever you have, if we communicate through language, and language has certain linguistics, a certain structure, that structure tells us something very specific. At the same time, sentences carry meaning to humans. So in other words, we derive a double benefit by deploying language. That's just the way we are. That's our ontological inheritance. We communicate through language. Language has its formal structure, subject-predicate structure. At the same time, it carries ontological meaning. So this is why he's focused on the word sentence, right? Because that's how we communicate. This is what we got. A premise is a sentence which either affirms or denies a predicate of a subject. Now I have a few general comments too. So now we presented the sort of the basic form, if you will, of a categorical syllogism. It has these three parts. The first and the second premise necessarily lead to the conclusion. Okay? Can I erase it? Go ahead. So I think here it's important or useful to make a few general comments at this point. So syllogism, of course, means the synthesis, to combine, to make complex things of an utterance. Okay, so we're dealing with the process of synthesis when we study this three-part structure that conveys a specific meaning, that is an arrived meaning using other meanings that are already generally well known to be false or true. So under 2, a syllogism means the synthesis I'm going to try to sort of bracket important words, words that seem important to me in this conversation. Synthesis, meaning, right? Synthesis, to combine. To combine in order to make. Complex things. In other words, we will not be humans if we did not synthesize, if you will, constantly. Right? We would be reduced to the level of simple communication with single sounds, growls, and so on and so forth, which you can also derive complexity there too. But if you deploy language, well, you can synthesize, you can combine in order to make very complicated things. Thoughts, for example, or meanings, and the conveyance of meanings. So on another level, being aware of this kind of a synthesis, which is pedagogical but also very, very real, right, in its implications, to be able to form synthesis in general is a very good habit to have developed. But how do you combine things to make things more complex? That in itself is a huge question. You know? Well, we do it intuitively when we speak, right? We have this ability to speak, and we learn, we acquire language sort of in the social context. We have, this innate ability to do that. But if we reflect how we do it, we arrive at the word synthesis, of which syllogism is an example. To combine, so a syllogism means the synthesis of an utterance, of a human utterance, obviously, because it would be cool to have a working human to dolphin converter, you know, kind of like, I know apparently people are working on these things for many decades, like how to find ways to translate human. So the syllogism points to the synthetic activity of thought. Now, again, I just want to say this again. Human activity in thinking could be very simple. It can be, right? It could be reduced to non-synthetic, if you will, communication. Yes, no, silence, fragments, which convey very little meaning or very basic meaning that's clearly understood without the necessity to engage in this kind of synthetic activity, right? But the goal is to do this. This is, or at least this is, especially if it's directed at a particular project, like if you are deploying this because you're trying to study linguistics, or if you're deploying this because you're trying to study politics in your world, or if you're deploying this because you're trying to study some kind of a disease, or whatever the case might be, complex activities, right, require this kinds of syllogistic thinking, if you will, which is synonymous with synthetic activity in thinking. Again, we can read Aristotle's definition of a syllogism, which is 24b18. So if you go to the, I guess I'll use this edition because that's the one we uploaded. So 24b18.
You're speaking from the section on the categories or from the prior?
From the prior analytics. 24b18. For some reason I can't find it as damn edition. I always found this edition. 24b18. Okay. This is on page 2 of the prior analytics. A deduction, which is a syllogism, is a discourse in which certain things having been supposed, which is premises 1 and 2, something different from the things supposed results of necessity, because these things are so. By because these things are so, I mean resulting through them. And by resulting through them, I mean needing no further term from outside in order for the necessity to come about. Here, I thought nothing. I thought something, but I didn't. So again, like we already said, right? Certain things are presupposed, meaning you already said two things, and based on these two things that you said, the conclusion automatically follows, but that's an unexpected result based on what you said already. In the sense that you wouldn't have thought that if you didn't go through the first two premises. Okay, a syllogism is a discourse, a logos, a human activity expressed through words or language. This is another way to define it. We can add the word, this definition under C. A syllogism is a discourse. human activity expressed through language or words. In Russian it's words, but I think in English it might be language. It's not even words. It's like the word, this word in Russian is a very rich word because it's almost like that which is spoken, which could be language or it could be words, but it's not that. It's whatever is spoken, you know, in that context. Like, in Aristotle, the syllogism is presented in a very terse kind of textbook way, if you will. Very concentrated. If I could make a coffee, it's like the most intense espresso. Like, what's the shortest espresso you have? Like, the most highly, it's like a very highly concentrated espresso. And then in other presentations, maybe in, no, that's a bad analogy, sorry, never mind. But what I meant was, in Aristotle's presentation, the syllogism is very compressed.
Turkish coffee, you mean?
Yes, like the grinds on the bottom, that kind of, whatever that's called, the residue of the Turkish coffee, you know, the mud-like structure, which is amazing, you know, you can like scoop it up and eat it, but it's not recommended. And whereas in Hegel,
Do the Greek one instead.
whereas in Hegel, you know, you'll see a lot more, especially we're not going to read the Science of Logic, but in Hegel is really a discourse, you know, much more so, because it's vastly sort of interrogated through different points of view and sort of. In Marx, it's a discourse, right? Because it's used in capital, and then through that it's used in all the follow-up works against and for. So in Aristotle, we just have the Turkish sort of the ground essence of this form.
So when you say it's a human activity, you mean it's not any human activity, it's a human activity expressed through words.
Yes, a human activity expressed through words.
Okay.
The conclusion, we can add another point here, which is stated after the premises, follows necessarily, just paraphrasing Aristotle himself, based on what the premises said or expressed in meaning. If the premises are understood to be true, then the conclusion must also be true. Okay? Again, we keep making these parallels with Marx because that's where we're going to go eventually, or next semester, next in the spring. There's a certain, even though Marx, of course, I'm learning now myself, also made certain errors or certain assumptions because he was a person of his time and so on and so forth. There's a certain, like a certain light bulbs go on when you sort of read that reasoning in volume 2 or in volume 1 about the world you live in, because there's a certain necessity to his conclusions. The conclusions ring true because of everything that's been stated at the premises. Yeah.
I have a question. So, in regards to like creating a conclusion or through the premise 1, establishing premise 1 and 2, is there an order? In other words, can the philosopher, let's say, develop a conclusion and then look for that structure?
Look for the premises,
yeah.
then.
Or is there any order to that flow of thought? Like
I
back
mean,
and forth, does it matter?
I guess if you arrive at a conclusion, then the question would be, how did you arrive at that conclusion?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, maybe it's some kind of an instinctive insight that you brought into, but Aristotle would probably say that instinctive insight was simply the non-verbalized as of yet premises that you already started from.
Are all syllogisms equal?
What do you mean equal?
Well, let's say, I don't know, sort of a, for example, a privilege theory thing over class-centered analysis of history. So if you say all of history is driven by class. And then-
Aristotle would say there are three figures in the syllogism according to Aristotle, right? Depending on where the mediating term is located in the premises. Is it a subject in the first premise versus a predicate in the other premise? Is it a predicate in both premises, or is it a subject in both premises? And Aristotle will say that only the first figure is the perfect one, by mood and by location. This is where it gets mysterious. The second and the third figure are not perfect in the way they project their meaning. And that's where the difficulty and the subtlety comes in Aristotle interpretations. Like, why is the first predicate, why is the first figure the perfect one for Aristotle? That he prioritizes that one. Right?
Isn't it just a formalization of the Platonic dialogues or the Socratic dialogues?
I mean, you can go back to Rebecca's thing.
Right.
You can begin with a conclusion. Class struggle is the motor of history. How did we get there as that conclusion? So you can backtrack to say, what would be the minor and then the major premise to this to come to that kind of conclusion in terms of a syllogistic reasoning. Because Marx advances that with Engels in the 1848 manifesto, as a propositional form, as a statement, not in the form of a syllogism.
Right.
Right? So there is a result. How does he get to that? I mean, to go back to where
But then
you
the question,
started.
the question is, if the Communist Manifesto begins by
yeah.
saying that politics is class struggle, as far as all the history that we know, is all the history that we're aware of shows that politics is class struggle, in a sense, right? But what makes him say that? Well, then the second paragraph of the manifesto begins with the pairs of the social classes that are in antagonistic relationship with each other. They are in a relationship of oppressor-oppressed. So he gives the example of the master-slave.
Freeman and slave.
Freeman and slave.
Patrician,
then there's the patrician and the plebeian.
Yeah.
And then there's the journeyman, and there's the lord
Guild
and the serf.
master, lord and serf.
Until you reach the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So the presentation is up front in Marx. He starts with the conclusion, right? But the conclusion will not be possible if certain presuppositions were there, such as knowing Roman history or reading Roman history in that sense, right? In that way. Because somebody might read Roman history by saying the peasants were simple creatures who were rightfully under the yoke of the control of the lords, right? But Marx is reading that class relation between the ruling class in the Roman Empire and the proletariat in Roman society. He's reading it in that sense, which is also true. The proletariat, the plebes and the patricians were in a class conflict. We know there were rebellions. We know there were civil war in Roman society. Of course, most of the time the patricians won. But the presentation of the conclusion may appear before the premises, of course. But how you got to the point is how you get to the conclusion. What makes the conclusion true? The conclusion can also be unexpected. If the premises that you came up with, right, led you in that way, this can also happen, right? So in terms of the priority, Aristotle prioritizes the first figure as he calls it the perfect one, for two reasons. We'll talk about this: position and mood. Yeah, and the syllogisms have different moods. This has to do with, this is like a more scholastic thing that later they went through all the possible permutations that Aristotle went through, and then they tried to find reasons why those were true. We're only scratching the surface. I mean, if you read the rest of the prior analytics, he goes through exhaustively all the different permutations possible. Of all the different sort of truth tables, if you will, as we might say.
What does mood mean
Yeah,
in this sense?
I'm so intrigued.
The way I understand it is that and I'll give you an example probably next time, but it has to do with the mediating term. It has to do with the middle term, which is essential. It has to do with in which premise does the middle term feel or mean, or in its meaning, closer, right, to what happens to the subject in the conclusion. So it has to do with meaning. In which premise the mediating term seems ontologically closer to what is expressed in the conclusion. Okay? And based on that, the syllogism is either more forced as you move towards a conclusion, or more naturally and more obviously true. So there's a very great sensitivity to meaning as you go through these logics. See, when we think logic today, we think higher mathematics, because that's what logic has become in the modern revolution of the 19th century. With Aristotle, it's an ontology.
So when you say ontologically natural, you mean to the conclusion?
Yeah.
Not to the philosopher posing that.
Well, to the philosopher posing that, yeah, to the philosopher and his or her readers, right, posing that
It's
structure.
happening within the sentence, within language.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. So, okay. Again, one more point. We have a syllogism only if the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises and the terms that those premises contain. We'll do the terms right now, shortly. And from nothing else outside of those premises and the terms contained therein. So really the whole formation of meaning has to happen in these three sentences. Right? This is sort of the... why three? Well, if you had 5, you can reduce them to 3 anyways. He went through the permutations. It can't be 5. It's not necessary. Because you can reduce it fundamentally to 3. If you really reduce it and think hard, the reduction goes to 3, not to 2, not to 4, not to 7, but 3. If another term needs to be brought into the syllogism from the outside to clarify why the conclusion is so, then we're not dealing with a syllogism. It's okay. It's okay. You don't have to use a syllogism in order to gain certain meaning through language. The conclusion, however, must be different in its meaning from the premises that led to it. The conclusion cannot simply repeat or augment a premise. That's a requirement. So I think that's an important clarifying point from the get-go. The conclusion must be different from the premises. That led to it. The conclusion cannot simply repeat. Also, and this is important, or augment. In other words, the conclusion can't simply change slightly the meaning of the premise. You can't get away with it that way. Right? I mean, if we go back to the first example, all men are mortal. Like, what are you talking about? You're talking about something very universal statement. All humans die. Okay, I get it. Then what do you want to talk about? Well, Socrates is a man. Whoa, okay. I get it. That's true. I mean, it's a historical figure. It's in the history of philosophy. We know about this person because of Plato and other sources. Well, what else? So what? Right? Well, Socrates is mortal. There's a certain unexpectedness to that sentence. Because now, I was thinking that Socrates is simply human. I didn't necessarily care about the fact that he's immortal. But now that you say that, I tend to agree with it. Why? Well, why? Because it's obvious, since all people are mortal, and he's a person. Right? So there's a certain chain that happens where the conclusion is different from the premises, but it also necessarily follows from them.
Can we make syllogisms that are like wagers? Like, can we say things like Trump is destructive?
And? So that's, if you say that would be one premise.
It's a premise.
That's the first premise.
Yeah,
Right.
okay.
And then,
I mean,
I'm just
destructive is your predication.
and then,
But you also want to start, remember, from the universal to the particular.
Right, Trump would be the minor premise.
so men are destructive.
Okay,
Trump is a man.
men are destructive. So you mean something like this.
All men are destructive.
All men are
Trump.
destructive.
Trump is a man.
Trump is a man.
Right.
Okay? Thus,
Therefore,
by the way, this is the mediating, but we're going to get to this, but
Therefore-
mediating, the middle term
The
is the
middle
term
term.
that appears formalistically, is the term that appears in both premises, but not in the conclusion.
yeah.
But it makes the conclusion
You're
possible.
doubling the two terms.
So men are destructive. Okay, so we presume that this is some kind of a universal also. Yeah, they're destructive. Men, we're talking about a universal here. Trump, now we're particularizing. Trump is a man, okay? Then the conclusion is?
Trump is destructive.
So that's the key to elementary patriarchy right there.
Is this
That's the
legitimate, is my
inference.
question. Is this legitimate reasoning?
Is it meaningful?
Wait, I think that
Is
something
it
about
valid?
it is
That's really the question you're
not-
asking.
Yeah.
Is it a valid
Right,
argument?
because
Yes, it
first
is.
premise is
Because
like,
you have
not
a
all men are
universal,
destructive, right?
a particular,
Exactly. So in other words,
you have a
there's a
predicate,
problem.
and
Yeah,
the
there's a
major,
problem.
and then the conclusion.
Is
What's
it
the
true to assert that all men are destructive?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Right.
not true, right? Because somebody can say, well,
But the syllogism doesn't necessarily have to lead to the truth.
That's my question.
but it has to. You have to
You
decide.
can have
whether
a
some-
valid
So,
argument.
so in other words, men are destructive is different than saying men are mortal. All men are mortal. That's clearly has a clear and ambiguous
Right.
meaning. Men are destructive. In
But
other words,
A
this would be
militant
a less
feminist would
useful-
say that
yeah.
about the patriarchy in terms of,
say
Certainly, yeah,
Yeah, a
exactly.
militant feminist could say that of patriarchal, thinking. All men.
This is what I'm wondering.
Aristotle would say.
Yeah,
It'll
okay.
become a form of
Okay.
sophistry, which is fine.
Mhm.
It would be a political weapon in a polemic, in a political battle between
Right.
radical feminists and patriarch, like conservative political organizations. Totally valid use in a sophistic sense, but that's different from what Aristotle's intentions in the syllogism,
Mhm.
right? So yeah, you could use this, but
But
it would
parts
be
of
more
the
of a
syllogism are always
sophistic
about-
argument in a syllogistic form, if you will. But it's not. It would be a different intentionality than Aristotle would have in this case. Yeah.
I think a correct syllogism would be like, some men are destructive, some men are named Trump, some men named Trump are destructive.
Yeah, you can particularize it that way.
Okay, well then, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, what about men, men are sometimes destructive, not like some men, but like men can be, does it have to be are and is, or can it have?
But then it's not an
Then
ontological
it's-
statement.
Okay.
It has to kind of have this
Yeah,
linguistic
equals.
validity, but also the ontological
Got
validity.
it.
as
It
well.
can't be it can't be an inconsistent, right?
Right.
You can't say there's sometimes the
Yeah.
sun.
Yeah, that's true. That's fundamentally important. There has to be some kind of a rigor in the meaning ontologically and linguistically. So I think that's an important. Okay,
I mean, the sun has come out as a completely illegitimate statement.
the sun
That
has
we
come
use
out.
always, the sun has
Right.
risen. It's a completely false statement.
Yeah, you would never see that in an
Yeah.
Aristotle syllogisms.
What?
Yeah.
You never see what?
Something as the sun will rise today, or the sun
You would
has
not
risen
see that.
today.
Really
Yeah,
like subjective.
Because it may not happen?
Why would you not see that?
Because
It's a
suns don't
subjective
rise,
thing.
and valid argument.
So in other words,
If
you're saying
if
it might
seeking
have
the
ontological
truth-
validity
Yeah,
for humans
there's
who
no-
would hear this,
yeah,
like, of course
yeah,
the sun's going to
Yeah,
rise.
yeah.
But you're saying that might not have.
Scientifically, it has no validity.
But
as a
that's not.
statement.
But that wouldn't necessarily be important because he's only interested in
No, I
linguistic
understand
and
that, but I'm just
ontological
talking, if we're gonna talk about levels of truth,
Right.
we
Well,
have
of
to.
course, yeah. I mean, there are many
Right.
levels. There's
Right.
different ways.
Right.
Here we're 2,500 years
Yeah,
ago.
no, I
so-
understand, yeah, I
and
understand.
yeah, he.
I mean, this was what Galileo and others,
Yeah.
took on in
Yeah.
modernity, right?
Yeah.
This was the shift.
Yeah, I mean, this
This
is
is what
not.
I'm really trying to drive out earlier is how, when I said the question about can all syllogisms be equal, is really driving at how does Aristotle mean to, separate the activity of syllogism from sophistry?
We're going to get to that example. He
Okay.
confronts that because sophist thinkers might say, philosophers might say, all men are mortal, I already know that Socrates is mortal by saying that first premise. Okay, so if you say all men are mortal, right? Does that make sense to you? Yes, of course, it's obviously true. Then I don't need to say Socrates is a man and thus Socrates is mortal, because the moment you say all men are mortal, it's already presumed that Socrates is mortal. You don't have to go through the next two steps. It's like a waste of time. Right? And Aristotle's counter-argument is that you have to suffer through the movement. Okay? You have to go through this part and be like, well, okay, so what are the consequences of that fact? What else can you, well, Socrates is a man, but so you can't just, in the presumption, in the pre-predicate sort of assumptions, you may introduce yourself or open yourself to sloppiness and thus perhaps error, or you're going to miss something, or something would become unnoticed, right? So there's a need to find the mediating point between the universal and the particular.
Right, but
If you're going to particularize something, you have to show clearly how you got there from the universal beginnings of that situation.
Yeah.
You
But
can't
the
just assume it, you know?
The sophist could argue, but the pre-predicative experience is mortality.
Yes,
So therefore, why are we,
yes,
particularizing this when it is common to all?
They
It's
could.
a universal affirmative.
they could.
Yeah, that's how they would probably respond. And they were very good at argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could, they
I
could.
mean, very good at argument. I mean, he wrote a whole thing about this, and he uses the word that Josh brought up earlier, sophistical refutations.
Yes.
Right? How do you refute the sophist arguments? So this is part of the general organon, that we're.
This was one of his major battles, to refute
with the sophists.
the light.
And Plato too, and Socrates.
In other words, to refute what the sophist thinkers could do by simply keeping the form of something, but ignoring its ontological meaning or content or reason for using it.
Yeah.
Because everything became a play of words on some
Yeah.
level. If linguistically you could create some kind of a logical structure, then it's fine. You can also come with nonsense. Socrates is a bird. You could reach these nonsensical, seemingly logically coherent things, but logical coherence is not simply a linguistic game, for Aristotle at least.
I mean, the amazing thing is the monstrosity of how this was used during the Middle Ages to tighten up the theological. From Boethius, Plotinus,
You're going to see Hegel
and
make
St.
those
Augustine, all the way up through Hegel, that you begin to see how this is tightened to restrict any kind of sophistical, and skeptical thinking.
And
This
Hegel
very,
is
very
you're going to see how Hegel criticizes
the
the scholastic kind of draining of a lot of the life that existed in this kind of thinking. Okay, just before we finish, I just want to present just an outline for the structure of a categorical syllogism. Maybe letter 3, I believe. A categorical proposition is a sentence which can contain 4 parts. This is just sort of the more mechanical. A quantifier, subject, term, copula, and a predicate. So I'm just going to shorten it by saying a proposition contains 4 parts. And because it is a sentence, it has these 4 parts. It has a quantifier. This becomes important later on. We're not going to get into this, but when it does all the different permutations. I'll give you an example later on of Venn diagrams that have been developed by Euler, Swiss mathematician, Enlightenment era, who rewrote the Aristotelian syllogisms using Venn diagram-like structure, so they're easier to understand the relationships. Okay, so we have quantifiers, subjects, the copula, and the predicate. Of course, all are important. Very briefly, the subject, we already did this with the categories. Example, obviously, the example I have here is just to get away from Socrates, all hawks can fly, right? So the subject would be hawks. So let's just write the sentence, because then we can have a visual. All hawks can fly. So of course, this would be the subject, when we can introduce the letter S, right? Traditionally, Aristotle used different letters as well, but let's just use S for subject. The predicate, Socrates is mortal, and the predicate is the P, letter P. The copula connects the subject to the predicate and is the all-important is, right, which in the history of philosophy plays a big role. And then the quantifier, of course, is all, none, some, right, which can be used in the various permutations. This would be the
Quantify. No?
sorry, quantifier.
Yeah, the all refers to all,
Yeah.
the some, and the none.
All,
Yeah.
some, and none, right? And this allows for all the different possible computations, if you will, these sentences. And now I think, unfortunately, well, next time we will get into the major minor premise and the terms, and then we can present the first, second, and third figures, and I think that's enough probably before we start into the Hegel.
And Rusty will come back.
And Rusty will come back, or he'll probably
We
send me
will,
another email. What are we covering? What are we covering next week?
Yeah.
I almost wrote back, well, you should come to class to figure it out.
That's the best thing to do. Come to class and find
This is
out.
not a, this is
That's
not
right.
a college
Yeah,
class.
you
My,
should-
some of
you
my
should
college
say,
students ask me
don't
this
pay
in
any
email,
attention to the man
like, what are we
behind the
covering?
curtain.
Well,
Come
come to
see
class
what's
to figure it
behind the
out.
curtain.
Like-
Yeah, that's right.
Copula is also a musical genre, isn't it? Or not?
It plays a role. I think so. How is it defined in music?
I thought it had to do with coupling. When the guy could be completely making things up. But yeah.
It's possible.
So what do you mean next week? Potentially.
I mean, yeah, I'm gonna check it out if it's gonna
Okay.
be, yeah, here, you know? I mean, yeah. I mean, it's a question of space. That's what it is, not a question.
Not of time.
Not of time.
Okay.